Okay.
Greetings, everyone. I'm back with Josh Denny, and we're going to continue our conversation. Last time we were talking about nature and working with nature, and how nature has affected both of us over our spiritual path development and such like. And so, Josh, welcome back. And where would you
Thank
like to start with today? Continuing on your
you.
life path.
Yeah, yeah. Start from some. Got to start from somewhere. It's funny, like trying to tell it in a sort of linear sequence, but always kind of like missing out bits, and so like having to go back and take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of thing. But yeah, like I said, like last time I kind of talked sort of about some of my early experiences, like up until the age of about, I suppose, like 18, 19, 20, that kind of age, and kind of this sort of awakening to what I suppose Gurdjieff calls the Keston body or the Keston world, or other teachers maybe call the astral world or the subtle world. And so yeah, like again, going back to sort of earlier than that, again as a kid, I think I would say I've been a seeker all my life. Like again, as far as I can, as I can remember, that's always been, I think, you know, kind of a deep yearning that was in me. Like as a young kid, I remember never really sort of being interested in, like, I don't know, getting rich or making a lot of money. And like I remember, like I suppose the kind of typical questions that adults ask kids, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And in a sense, to me, the question was kind of felt to be, in a sense, a bit irrelevant. It was like, well, I don't know, I'll probably get some kind of job or another. But again, that wasn't like, it wasn't something that was felt to be a main focus of my life or a main interest. Like, was in a sense irrelevant. Like, well, I'll get some kind of job, I'll pursue some kind of career. So, like, that kind of normal sort of, I guess, secular idea of what life, you could say should be about, or what people might be interested in doing over the course of their life or achieving, never really appealed to me. I knew kind of from, again, sort of as far back as I can remember, that was never what my kind of life was going to be about, or that was never going to be my main interest. Like what was most interesting to me was, you could say, like the inner world. Like, what is consciousness? What is awareness? What does it mean to experience? What does it mean that that I seem to be here in this physical world? I mean, I had the general kind of interest as a kid, and like you say, like I loved playing in nature and stuff like that, and was always quite interested in science and nature and geography and things like that. So I did have a curiosity towards the kind of physical world and learning about it in terms of science and stuff like that. But that was, like I said, never really my main drive or the main sort of question that drove me. I wanted to understand, what does it mean to be, to be a being, to be conscious, or that kind of thing. So the inner world was always seemed to be more kind of important to me than whatever I was going to end up doing in the outer world. I just kind of felt a secondary concern. So yeah, as a young kid, that was always there. That kind of, you could say, seeking, and but again, so obviously at some point, well, I say some point in time, I became kind of more conscious, or it became more of a conscious occupation to me to, like, be a seeker. Like I said, I came across the Gurdjieff work and other books and traditions, spiritual traditions, when I was in my, like, from about the age of 11 through my teens. So that was when I kind of, like, you could say, formally became a seeker. And that was the most important thing to me in my life. That was like, nothing else really satisfied. Again, I did engage in the normal, I wasn't just completely introverted and only engaged in, like, I don't know, spiritual kind of things. I did the normal things that a teenager or a child would do and enjoyed them, going out, getting drunk with my friends, or doing that kind of thing.
You didn't go and look for a teacher or anything then, or join a group or anything like that?
No, that kind of thing didn't happen till I was sort of in my teens. Like, because my parents had been sort of interested in spirituality, and particularly the Gurdjieff, like, work. They had, like, some connections, like friends and stuff. So it wasn't till sort of my teens that I made more connections that way and got to talk with, like, older people, who are interested in those ideas. And again, like, my mum and dad were interested in those ideas, and my dad more so than my mum. So I suppose, like, you could say, like, I guess my dad was probably like my first quote unquote teacher, because he was just somebody who'd been interested in those ideas longer than I had. I mean, that's, I never really had the sort of yearning to find a teacher, like in the sense of I need to find some kind of like perfect being, but I just was more open to meeting people, and I'm like, you know, well, what can I learn from this person or that person? So I was never really like striving to find a particular you know, teacher, I guess, because again, I think I'd always had a sense that, you know, the real teacher is within. You know, it's something that you could say you've got to find in yourself. Again, people can help you and you can learn stuff from that, but it's not, again, what I was after was kind of seemed to be something that you could say, find for yourself. No one can hand it to you on a plate. You know, they can give you ideas and things like that, but really what I suppose I was yearning for then was seemed to be something, you know, inside, or you could say it was like between me and God. You know, it wasn't really
your own
a case
discoveries.
Yeah. It was like, you know, it was felt to be something that couldn't be taught to me in the normal way. You know, like going to school and you can learn things from people. Like, I don't know, you could learn carpentry or you could learn maths. You know, so in that sense, kind of with physical activities, you could learn those kind of things. But I recognized what I was searching for wasn't of that kind of nature. It wasn't really something that somebody else could teach you or could be learned in the same way that you'd learn French or something like that, you know. So yeah, so I never really thought it was crazy to see.
I was just going to say, we've published, as you know, we've published some of your dad's writings at Hermes Risen magazine if people are interested.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. He was quite, you know, he explored various teachings, but he was, you know, quite interested. The Gurdjieff work was his sort of main interest for a lot of his life, and he'd been in groups and stuff. Like my mum and dad had been in groups, but that was mainly before I was born. But they still had connections, you know. So that's how I met some people who were interested in, and then later in my life participated in some of the groups, like Gurdjieff groups and stuff like that. But so yeah, so again, I had a sense of seeking all my life, but it wasn't until like from the age of 11 onward that I became a formal seeker. And again, as like I said, it was the most important thing to me, like in my life. And when I did like find practices and stuff like that, you know, like ideas of different meditations and stuff you could do, I was very gung-ho with it. Like I did like period, like kind of like Zazen meditations, you know, where you might spend like 10, 12 hours, like just sitting, not doing anything, you know, just meditating, or like fasting, you know, going for days without food, or like, you know, going days without sleep, you know. So I would say I was quite a keen seeker and pretty gung-ho about it. You know, I did like quite a lot of extreme things because that was, you know, there was a strong drive, you know, to try to find, you could say, like what I was looking for, you know. I mean, again, you could say in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was I was looking for. You know, I mean, I could try to define it in different ways. Again, I might come up with ideas of awakening or hear of ideas of enlightenment. I might say, yeah, that's, you know, I might think that's what I'm after. But, you know, again, it was just a drive that was there. You know, I couldn't necessarily label it, but there was obviously a strong seeking energy in towards the spiritual path, you know. So that was my main, you know, interest and occupation. And like I said, I did go very gung-ho into it, did like very extreme kind of practices and stuff like that. And like I was saying, that, yeah, like there was a kind of a process of awakening of what I would say the Christian body or the Christian world. And I mentioned some of the different things that can go with that, like altered states of consciousness, perceptions of the spirit world or the essence world, and things like telepathy. And I was curious about those things, so I did explore them, and like, you know, trying to do telepathy with people, or like put people into altered states, or like with animals, like the classic thing, you know, you can like knock out an animal using kind of subtle energy. So I did a lot of those kind of things, and there was a curiosity there. But even when I had those kind of experiences that went along with that sort of Christian body, they were just seen as more curiosities. Again, it wasn't, there was something in me that knew that that wasn't really what I was looking for. You know, it was like I could take them or leave them. That wasn't my main interest. You know, I didn't become enthralled with like telepathy or like doing things with the subtle energy. It was just kind of, that, you know, that was interesting. It was kind of interesting to verify that those kind of things do exist. But again,
we need to just clarify though, you never harmed any animals. Because it sounded like you were putting out animals, but I know what you mean. You were trying to connect with the animals and make a contact work with them. You're not
Well, I mean,
staring at goats to, you know, like
I did do that. I did do that. I did. I wasn't trying to harm them, but I did experiment with.
Exactly. It's just the
With
way you said it. It could be taken the wrong way.
no, I never like tried to kill one, but I did experiment with like putting them to sleep and find that kind of thing. You could
That's
do
what
that.
you meant. See, when you said putting out animals, some people might think you meant putting out animals. But yeah, you
No,
putting them
no, I've never been, I've always loved animals. So, no, I never tried to do anything like that. But I was just saying that, I was curious in those things and I did. And when I kind of got, like some validation that those things were possible, it was just more of a satisfaction of a curiosity. Again, it wasn't like something that I wanted to carry on pursuing ad infinitum. It was just like, oh, that's curious. But it wasn't, again, it never really satisfied, again, what I was kind of seeking in me, whatever it was that I was seeking for. So, like, again, I did have a lot of experiences of that subtle realm through those years, like doing these practices and stuff. And they were very interesting. And there was a certain kind of liberation, like with waking up to that, because it can, like I said, it can free you up from a lot of the kind of conditioning and suffering that goes along with the idea that I'm a limited physical being. So if you kind of wake up to your sort of essence, you kind of know yourself beyond the physical nature. So comparatively, that can be very liberating if I've only believed myself to be, a physical being. So again, sort of, I did a lot of those practices up, from sort of 11 till my early 20s. But also as another sort of thread running throughout my life, again, I did, even though I was like seeking really avidly and doing a lot of like, say, intense practices and trying a lot, there was also something in me that kind of had the sense that what I was really after, what I was really looking for, could never be achieved by doing stuff, like it was kind of recognized that what I was really longing for could never be achieved by like doing a meditation or doing a practice, because it was, I guess you could see, it was seen to be something deeper than that, something that couldn't be produced by action, something you could say non-causal, like, so again, I was doing all this seeking, and yet somewhat paradoxically to that, there was a kind of recognition in the sense that, well, none of these things are really going to satisfy this, what is the deepest kind of longing in me, or this deep, kind of whatever was the motivation for this seeking, so there was a kind of a strange paradox, like doing the crazy meditation practices and stuff like that, and being a really avid seeker, doing those kind of things, and at the same time kind of knowing that none of that was really going to provide me for what I was seeking for, essentially.
I kind of have to jump in here and say I had the same kind of thing happen to me, but because I used to meditate, but I now see maybe I wasn't meditating properly. I know I did visualizations well, but maybe I wasn't clear in my mind and meditating correctly or in the right way. And then one day I was reading some Madame de Saussman, and I'm sure it was her that said it. What's the point of sitting and meditating? It doesn't do anything. And it kind of got in my craw. And I'm like, who's she to say that? But then I couldn't meditate anymore. I could still do visualizations or follow a guided meditation, but I couldn't sit and do nothing. So I don't know if her words saying that got into me, and then it's worked on me, that in a way of, I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I do find it very difficult to meditate these days. So I'm still not sure if it's also because of all the wireless energy going around. I think that affects a lot of us. I've been told by someone I shouldn't meditate in a house that's got a router in it and things like that. But obviously you've stopped all this before we had all the 4G and everything. So, sorry, I just wanted to mention that I found it interesting that the Swordsman said that.
Yeah. I mean, like, it was just a sense that it wasn't, again, the sense that there was anything like right or wrong with like meditation, because from my experiences from doing it, I saw that it could, like, it could produce results. Like I say, like doing those exercises did like produce lots of strange experiences and did open up certain capacities, like, telepathy or perception of the spirit world, that kind of thing, or like being able to do energy work, like sort of healing work. So I did see that those kind of practices could produce results. And again, there was no sense that there was a right or wrong about it, but there was just a deep sense that what I was truly seeking for, what I was you know, what I was looking for was never going to be found or couldn't be produced by those kind of things. That was all. So I'm just saying there was, in a sense, there was a strange kind of paradox there, or apparent contradiction. That on the one hand, I'm doing all this intense seeking and a lot of these intense practices, and yeah, I am getting certain experiences from them. But at the same time, kind of having a deeper knowing that none of this is really going to, is not going to provide. It might, you know, it might have relative interest or relative use, but it's never going to really satisfy whatever it is that I'm truly, you know, seeking for or longing for. And sort of kind of a kind of experience that sort of, you could say, like validated that happened when I can't remember the exact age, but maybe like 18, 19, 20, that sort of period. Again, it's a hard experience to try to describe, but it was like, I think I was driving at the time, which is a strange one, but it was like the whole manifest world in terms of, like, you know, your visual perception, you know, the apparent world in front of you kind of dissolved. And I was kind of like you could say in a void. It's just like a way to try to describe it, you know, the absence of content. And within this void, there was kind of like something about the size of a postage stamp, say it like that, right? And what that postage stamp was the whole, you could say, manifest world, if you want to say the universe, and everything that could ever like happen in it, you know. And I think there's in some traditions, other people have spoken about it, like Julian of Norwich. I think she says she has a vision with Christ, and Christ like has this little walnut in his hand, and she says to him, like, "What's that?" And he says, "Well, it's everything that's made, was made, or will ever be made. You know, it's just this like the size of a walnut." Or in some of the Indian traditions, they say that the whole sort of apparent manifest world or universe is like a point of light. You know, it kind of appears within a little tiny aperture. And sometimes they say it's in the heart. You know, like they say the whole world exists in consciousness, which is like a point in the heart, or sometimes they locate it in the head. So there was this seeing, like this dissolving of the apparent world, like the scene that I was in, you know, driving in the car into a void. And then within the void, there was this little like speck of light, postage stamp, something about that sort of size in infinite infinite void. And that postage stamp was seen to be like, you know, what we consider to be the whole manifest universe, you know, all the people in it and everything that could ever take place within it. So again, in that kind of seeing, that was another, in a sense, another, say, verification, but another pointer, in the sense that everything I could do and all the, like, you know, meditations or experiences that I could have, in a sense, were all, you know, they were all just like, in a sense, contained in this little point that was like, you know, hovering in infinity, you know. So in that sense, they were seen to be somewhat irrelevant. You know, they could be interesting and stuff, but in terms of the vastness of, you could say, reality or what exists beyond the manifest world, it was kind of like seen to be, you know, well, quite small. You know, the comparison of a peanut to infinity is quite. So anyway, that made
interesting is that you were driving, so you wasn't doing this on purpose. You were driving, and then this just happened. Because I hear things like this happen, not exactly the same as that, but sometimes things just happen. It's a bit worrying. You was driving at the time. Thankfully, no accidents. But it does.
I didn't drive.
Of William Blake and his, you know, what's in the grain of sand. You know, infinity's in the grain of sand.
Yeah. So again, it was just a kind of like, you know, like somewhat shocking experience, but also a kind of a validation of the sense that I'd had that, like, you know, that what I was longing for, in a sense, wasn't really part of the kind of experiential world, you know, the world where, you know, of time and space, and where you can, you know, or things that you can produce, states that I could produce, or things that I could learn, you know, from my own actions or my own volition. So again, that was again, even from that period onwards, I still engaged in a lot of practices and meditations and seeking and stuff. But again, there was this contradiction in the sense that there'd been these seeings that kind of didn't really matter, and that also the sense that that wasn't really going to be able to supply what I was kind of looking for. And again, as another, like, going back as far as I can remember, as you know, as long as I've been a kid, there was always a sense that, like, to describe it, that to exist, to be, you know, to have to be, to have a being, to exist, or to experience being or existence was a kind of a limitation. Again, a way to describe it would be like, it was to be, to exist was felt almost like a bit of like a pair of shoes that was slightly too tight. You know, it was kind of, it wasn't that I wanted to like kill myself or anything like that. I enjoyed, you know, life and existence, but there was some kind of recognition that, you know, again, like to be or to exist was a limitation. And again, you could say that that was kind of re-emphasized in that experience of like, you know, the void and this kind of like seed in it, because that seed was like, you could say, existence. What it was, you know, existing in was like non-existence, or the non-manifest, you know, infinite void is a way to describe it. So that sort of happened in like, yeah, my late teens or the early 20s. And that, again, that corresponded with kind of with a bit more of a development of the Keston world. But then jumping ahead just to another like significant experience, when I got to a sort of early, like about 30, there was an experience of, again, it's really hard to describe, but like consciousness woke up, you could say, in the deep dream state, you know, like, again, there's nothing there. There's just consciousness without an object, you could say. So it kind of, you could say consciousness awoke in the deep dream state. And from that state, the process of waking up in the morning was seen. Like, so the re-emergence of the physical world, like my bed, my bedroom, and, you know, the bed that I was sitting in was perceived. And along with that, what was also witnessed was the kind of re-emergence of Josh, you know, as in like all the memories coming back, you know, that tends to happen on waking. So again, in that sort of experience, it was seen that, well, obviously from witnessing that, I knew that I wasn't that. I wasn't the little person who appears to fall asleep at night and wake up in the morning. You know, I was this, you could say, this consciousness. And it was kind of seen that that consciousness is always present. That kind of consciousness witnesses the waking up in the morning, falling asleep, witnesses like the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. It's always present and witnesses those states. But up until that point, again, I wasn't aware of that. And I'd been under the impression, I guess, that most people do, that they kind of ceased to exist in deep dreamless sleep, and that they seemed to wake up in the morning. So prior to that, there was the experience of discontinuity, you know, between like waking up in the morning and then a discontinuity and falling into the dream, and then another discontinuity and going into deep sleep, and like vice versa, you know. But in that experience, it was kind of seen that, well, really, the consciousness, you could say, that you are, or that I was, is permanent, you know. And from that sort of point onwards, there was no longer that sense of the discontinuity between those three states. You know, you could say that kind of consciousness was realized to be permanent, or you could say became permanent then. And it was seen that that I wasn't the little subjective self, the identity, the person who wakes up in the morning and appears to, fall asleep at night. And again, in certain traditions, that is often what is called self-realization, or the realization of universal consciousness, or sometimes they talk about it as the universal I am. Because again, it was seen that that consciousness that witnesses those three states is the only consciousness. It's the one consciousness. It's not like there's many consciousnesses, but it's just, it appears to diversify itself through the means of the person. The person who wakes up, if you like, is just like a vehicle, for that objective consciousness or universal consciousness. And through the little person, it appears that there appears to be loads of people, but it's really just the same singular consciousness, or the same I am. And it's that kind of one I am that everybody's apparent sense of I is kind of attached to, So that was, again, a big, you could say, shock or liberation, because again, it was a freeing from the kind of identification with the person, the one who thinks that they like wake up in the morning and fall asleep, but also the one who thinks that they've kind of been born, because it's only the subjective, you could say, like identity that appears to have been born in time, and appears that it's going to die at another time. And again, so in tradition, they kind of link that with self-realization of universal consciousness, or the singular I am, or you could say real I, again, people like with the Gurdjieff work, their ideas about what real I is. And some of the way it's talked about, it can appear as if it's something that's going to be a personal possession, like I'm going to develop my own real I. Whereas from this perspective, real I is just that singular consciousness. There's only one I am, or like in the Bible, you could say like God says, I am that I am. So there's really, you could say only one I am. And the individual sense of I that people can have is just kind of a manifestation or expression of that. And that was very liberating, because that kind of liberated me from experience or changing states of experience, or being kind of attached to experiences, whether like good or bad, or like this kind of seeking to try to produce experiences, so that was a massive liberation. But even some people, again, in some of the traditions, the way they talk about that as if that's the final or the ultimate liberation or the ultimate freedom. And again, I can kind of see why they would talk about it, because it's realizing that you are this unlimited, like unborn, undying, eternal consciousness. It's the one I am. You could say it's the only consciousness, or the only I am. You could say the only being, if you like, or the self. Sometimes that's why they call it self-realization. Like in Indian tradition, they call it the self. It's the same self that, I think in the Bhagavad Gita, they say it's the same self that looks out through every pair of eyes. But when we're identified with our own apparent identity, we can't really realize that. We don't realize that there's only one being or one consciousness that we're interacting with through all these apparently different people, apparent different sets of eyes.
Well, my thing with that, of when people get to that, is they need to, I think, figure out, well, what do I do now? It's like in Theosophy, they talk about coming to the silence. What's beyond the silence, or the voice of the silence? What's beyond that? What do you do next when you've reached that state? Right. So when you was going along in the driving, and you obviously wasn't thinking, I need to find out about the real world, but there wasn't any guidance from anyone. It just suddenly, bing, happened. There wasn't like a guide turned up, or you didn't have a feeling. And obviously it must have felt like it lasted a certain amount of time, but when you came back to driving, like in the world, it was probably instantaneous.
Yeah, I mean, there was no, I wasn't like, I was just driving. I wasn't particularly like, doing any practices or anything. And just in an instant that happened. And again, it's hard to talk about it, obviously, but you could say it was a kind of timeless experience. But I suppose, like, in terms of coming back, it probably didn't last that long. It was probably maybe only, a few seconds or a few minutes. I can't really remember the apparent duration of time that it lasted to, like, then coming back into the car. But again, a sort of analogy I kind of use for it is like, imagine that, like, what you're experiencing now is like looking through a keyhole, an aperture, and that's what you're looking through to see the whole manifest world. You're like looking through a keyhole into a room, and then it was like, your eye coming away from the keyhole, and then seeing that, the keyhole and everything, the whole manifest world that's in that keyhole was in, like, infinite void, or I don't know, infinite space, whatever you want to put that. And so that was quite shocking, because it, you could say it showed the unreality, not necessarily a good word, of the manifest world, or just the limitations of it. That in a sense, everything that is kind of perceivable or experienceable in terms of a content, something that appears, was like, comprised something the size of a peanut in infinite void, and like, obviously everything that I was, you could say, trying to do by way of meditations and stuff was all, all activity within that little sphere, so that was again a kind of a shock, but on the one hand, it did validate that deep sense that I had, that what I was looking for wasn't going to be able to be, like, found or produced by doing, like, all these practices and stuff. There was something beyond that, or also that maybe that sense as well that I had that like existence or being itself was a kind of, in a sense, a limitation, and that perhaps what I was like really looking for was beyond existence or beyond even being. I mean, you know, it may sound crazy, like, well, what's beyond existence? What's beyond, you know, beyond being? You know, the mind can, okay, you can only kind of tend to picture that perhaps as a kind of a void or something, or an absence or darkness or something like that. So, but yeah, again, like I said, seeking even after that experience and doing various practice and stuff did continue. But like when I was talking about this kind of realization of, I don't know what I want to call it, I am, that was another kind of significant liberation, again, because prior to that, even with having like an awakening to the Kestion world, all those experiences, or even like waking up to kind of essence, they were still centered around the kind of what I call the subjective I, you know, the sense of me as a person who was, you know, you could say born at some period of time or is going to die at another, you know, the kind of the sense of an individual I, you know. And even with that awakening to the kind of subtle world, there was still that sense of consciousness not being permanent, you could say. You know, there was still the apparent experience of gaps in consciousness, like, you know, a gap in consciousness falling to sleep, and a gap in, you know, going into deep sleep, and then a gap in consciousness like coming out of that to, you know, to waking up in the morning, you know. So when there was the kind of, okay, it's hard to talk about it, when there was consciousness was kind of woke up to itself in the deep sleep state, put it that way, and the process of kind of like waking up in the morning was seeing, then it was realized that consciousness was always permanent and always had been. And yet for some strange reason, there had been this appearance of like gaps in consciousness, you know, that consciousness disappeared in deep sleep and then, you know, re-emerged in waking up in the morning, you know. So it was kind of seeing that I, you know, the I of that consciousness was not, you know, was not only the limited kind of subjective I, the person who falls asleep and, you know, wakes up in the morning, you know. You could see that kind of subjective I as just an expression of the universal I. You know, it appears to the single I appears to diversify itself through all these apparent people who have their own, you know, like first person point of view, but really like what's behind that is just the you know, one singular I, you know, whatever you want to call that. So
I think a lot
again,
of
that was
people
another.
would really change if they knew that.
Yeah,
People were aware of
yeah,
that. They would act so differently in their lives and probably be more aware of that, you know, we're all one, even though
yeah,
sometimes it is difficult to comprehend that we're all one when you see some people that are despicable or whatever. But we have to remember
yeah,
it's not awaken to the fact that we are all one, that we are all coming from this, whatever it is, this divine
yeah,
source, and that we're all a part of it. And that's why what we do in this life, all our actions and everything affects the divine source as well, because we are part of that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously it was kind of transformative for me, but again, I can't really say that it necessarily had a massive impact on my character, put it that way. Because again, you could say in that seeing that there's the kind of, you know, the one single consciousness or universal I, and then like as manifestations of that, there are all these apparent like people, you know, like there was subjects who have their own characters, but in a sense they're all that same I, or what they sometimes call the self in like Eastern tradition. They're all, you could say they're all the same self, but playing the roles. It's the one self appearing as, you know, you could say they're all like, all the many people are like finger puppets on the singular hand of God. So in that sense, yeah, it was liberating, but mainly more from a personal perspective, because it was seeing that, again, what I truly was, you could say, was that singular consciousness, permanent consciousness, rather than the apparent subjective I, the Josh, the individual, the person who, like, you know, has all these memories, and, you know, wakes up and falls asleep and appears to have a, you know, a real individuality, you know. So yeah, it was liberating in the sense of realizing yourself as the one consciousness, or the one I am, or the one being, you could put it that way. So it was the liberation more in the sense from disidentification, you could say, with the apparent person, you know.
What do you
So
think
that
we
was,
do when we go to sleep then? Do you think that's a part of that's your consciousness is still going out to other realms?
well, that's one way of looking at it. Like you could equate dream experiences with the astral world, you could say, you know, but they just tend to, people's dreams tend to be at a sort of low level awareness, you know. So, but you could look at them as astral experiences, you know, or what they sometimes call of the realm of the planets, but yeah, the astral realm. But in a sense, those experiences happen, you could say, by way of this subjective eye. You know, you could say the subjective eye is like a vehicle through which the universal eye can have all these different kinds of experiences. It could experience waking up, waking states, and it could experience dream states or altered states of consciousness. But in a sense that, you know, they're all a play of the one self, the one consciousness, you could say, the one being. But yes, I was going to say, yeah, it didn't really necessarily change much in terms of my character, but I suppose it does make a difference. No, you could say knowing yourself as that singular consciousness or self, and that's why in some traditions that is considered as like the ultimate liberation, to know yourself as kind of the unbounded eternal consciousness within which the whole manifest world appears with all its apparent different beings, you know. So yeah, you could say from that point on that was a big liberation. And again, it was different to the kind of waking up to the astral world, because like physical experience and astral experience was still was experienced from the vantage point of that subjective eye. You know, there was still a sense that of being an individual, you could put it like with my own consciousness or my own essence. You see what I mean? Rather than, you could say, being aware of the one that appears to express itself in many essences or many individuals, you know. So just to speak it in Gurdjieff's terms, like relate to the difference between like the Keston world, like waking up to your essence and becoming aware of other essences, you know, or other kind of spirits, and what he might call the realm of the soul or real I, which is kind of, in one sense, it's beyond any state of experience, any changing state of experience, and is singular. You know, it's not like there's not many eyes. Many realize there's only the one eye, or there's only one consciousness. You know, so that's, in a sense, it's a kind of a step up. You're speaking like linearly from the Keston realm, because I said that in the Keston realm, you still experience is still centered around this apparent individual, and you can interact with other essences. You know, whereas like the you know, in the realm of the soul, then, or the real I, there's only the one. You know, and you kind of know yourself as that, and it's independent of any state of experience, because it's that, you could say, which knows all states of experience, or in which all states that of experience appear, you know, which is why it's often called like the unchanging or the eternal, as compared to all the realms of like astral states or physical states, which have a kind of content to them and are changing, you know. So yeah, that was a big liberation. And again, that also kind of, in a sense, again, kind of you could say it throws the typical notion of like what might be considered as the spiritual search out the window at that point, you know, because like you could say, if you know yourself as the one consciousness, which is kind of like, you know, eternal, you know, you could say, well, what more is there? In one sense, what more is there to do? Or that if there's no longer so much of an identification with the subjective individual self, which is the one who tries, you know, can exercise its own apparent volition and do meditation practices or experiences of that. If there's no longer and that's the one who typically goes on the spiritual quest, you know. So in a sense, like that is often what people report as the end of their journey, because you could say that to an extent, you know, seeking can end from that point.
That
You
seems
know,
quite sad. Surely they should then think there must be more to this and then use what they know. I don't know. I find that peculiar.
it's just I could understand from that experience again. Like if you know yourself, or when I say yourself, it's a hard way of putting it, but if you know the that you are the I am, the universal consciousness within which all experience, appears, and all apparent different separate selves appear, then yeah, it can kind of it doesn't mean that, like I say, that life doesn't appear to go on, and people, could be interested in what they're interested in, but it could put an end to the quest, in the sense of like the this trying to to reach a goal or something, because it's you know yourself as the one. I'm just saying, it's spiritual practices could carry on, but they wouldn't be carrying on, you could say, with the same motivation.
Yeah, that's what I think I'm trying to get at. Surely your motivation would change and you would start doing something in a different way. Like, I suppose for us, because I kind of feel the same as you, or I've had that kind of experience, not exactly the same, but aware, which has made me even more of, right, I must, it's going to sound messianic, but I must do good in this world, because I see that there is a goodness out there to work for, where I feel like if somebody then went, that was the end, which I do know people who have stopped their search, and I wonder if this is why, because they feel, well, I've done it, and that gives them no more impulse, where to me that gave me even more impulse to go forward and continue on my spiritual path of, right, there is more to learn, even though I know that everything I believe in is true.
I suppose well, like subjectively speaking, it could appear to affect different people in different ways. But all I'm saying is that it could put an end to the same motivation. Like I said, like spiritual practices or whatever, life can continue in whatever way it does. But you could say there might not be the same motivation behind it, because whatever is engaged in, you could say, from that point on, is not engaged in from the perspective of being the subjective individual. You could say it's engaged in from knowledge of being the one, the singular I. So relatively speaking, it could affect people's characters in different ways. They could become more loving or not. But to an extent, you could say that the seeing of that, in a sense, makes that irrelevant, because if everybody is a manifestation of that same, like, the self, then they're all just like finger puppets on the hand of that self, and they'll play out the way that they play out, whether they appear to like be engaged in a spiritual quest, or they appear to be like just a materialistic person, or whether they appear to be like a good person or a bad person. You could say they're all equally expressions of the one, and they all go on in whichever way they do. So that was like I said, that was a great liberation, in my own case, because up until that point there had still been a kind of an identification with the subjective I, and the notion of like doing various practices is in order to like seek, you could say, new experiences, or like personal development. So there was a kind of, you could say, a liberation from that. It's not to say that in terms of my life that I can still engage in meditation, things like that, but it's just from a very different perspective. It's not so much motivated by the same kind of personal subjective perspective. The experience that I am a real separate self who was born and who will die at a certain point in time, or who needs to do this, that, or the other.
Yeah, because that kind of revelation hopefully would encourage you to, obviously you're still doing your path, because we're here now talking about all this, but it must have made you see your path in I was going to say a different way. Of course it did. But you never gave up, you never stopped, or you made adjustments maybe.
It did have an influence. It did have a certain amount of, like, say, influence on the the subjective character, because that, it's different. It's quite a different experience if I'm interacting with another person and I believe that they're a real separate person, to where I know that it's the same I that I'm interacting with. That I'm only interacting with the one. That obviously that can change the experience and possibly how you relate to people. But I'm just saying, there's necessarily no like guarantee on how that would affect the apparent person in terms of their character. It might make them more loving, but it might not. You know, that's what I'm saying. In a sense, it kind of makes whatever the character does or doesn't do, in a sense, irrelevant. You know. So that anyway, that was another like significant, you could say, turning point, and like the realization of permanent consciousness, no longer having the sense of discontinuities in consciousness, or no longer having the sense of being the subjective self who wakes up in the morning and loses consciousness when they fall asleep. You know, that can be quite a big shock to people, because that seems to be the experience of most people. They say, "Oh, well, I lose consciousness when I fall asleep, and I regain it when I wake up in the morning." So to know yourself or the self beyond that can be quite a shock, and like I say, it can change the perspective on things. Whether or not it changes the personal behavior, it may do or it may not do. I'm just saying it's just something separate to that. So yeah, that was like a big, I don't know, call it liberation, because again, then you know yourself as beyond any experience. You know that you're not subject to any experience, because you are the consciousness that enables any experience, and within which appears the subject, the personal subject, the one who wakes up in the morning and goes through whatever experiences they go through. And again, in some traditions, they do speak of that as like the ultimate liberation, to know the one consciousness, or the one self, or the one universal I am. But in my own case, there was still a certain amount of dissatisfaction with that. Even though, like I say, even though it was a massive liberation, there was something that was still like, no, this is not what I'm after. You could say, that there must evidently be something beyond consciousness, or even universal consciousness. Again, in some of the traditions, they do speak of consciousness as the kind of be all and end all. They regard it as the one, the ultimate. But like in my own case, there was the sense that, well, obviously there must be even something beyond consciousness, or beyond this universal consciousness or universal I am. So there was still a certain amount of dissatisfaction, or still a certain amount of, even after that, a certain amount of seeking was still going on. I haven't found what I'm looking for.
Well, that's what I'm looking for, and that's why I was sort of saying about what I was saying about earlier, and how some people, like what you were saying, say there. I think there's more beyond, and there's more to be offered. It's like I wouldn't say a test, or perhaps even a trial, maybe, of, right, if you get stuck here, then you're not going to be given the next stage. You have to go beyond the silence, beyond the realm of what or the border that you've come up to, because you think, right, that's it. It's not. There is more. And I don't know why I know that, but I just do.
It could be different. Again, I can understand why, if that was experienced or realized, it could be interpreted that way, because it's a massive liberation and a massive change compared to what seems to be the ordinary experience. Again, most people do apparently seem to regard themselves as an individual. I'm a real person, and I was born at such and such a time. And, I'm Josh. I have this characteristic or that characteristic, and that's what I am. But so to know yourself as universal consciousness it's a big shift. And so I can understand, and it is kind of like unlimited. It's it's the consciousness within which all all states of experience appear. So it is a massive liberation. And so I could understand why, if that was kind of realized, that it could be taken as the be all or end all, or why the energy of like seeking could stop for someone there, because it's quite it's very liberating, and blissful. You know yourself beyond all states of experience, including all states, suffering, or any other state. You know yourself beyond the highest state and the lowest state, because again, they're just appearances within this consciousness, or known by it. So yeah, I can understand why people might, you could say, stop there. And again, there's no judgment here on saying that this person should stop there or shouldn't stop there. It was just, in my case, there was something not not satisfying about that. There was still this, like, seeking energy, like, oh, this is not what I was really looking for. And but along with that, there must be something beyond it then.
So what did you do next?
Yeah. Well, in terms of normal life, I just carried on living out my normal life, but obviously from a radically different perspective. But it wasn't too long after that I could say then the next significant chapter in the story of my life occurred. And this is even harder to talk about. Like, it's hard enough to try to describe, like, universal consciousness, or it's hard to talk about in normal language, even like waking up to the astral world and then question states. But it was this last chapter that I'm trying to describe that was the kind of, finally there was the sort of resolution to, or if you could say the finding of what I'd always been seeking. Now, it's hard to describe it, but in a sense, it was what it concerned was going beyond consciousness altogether. Like, say, this, you can wake up to the universal consciousness within which all states or states of consciousness appear. But again, in some traditions, they talk about the absolute, then you could say, or you could use another word for that as God, as beyond even universal consciousness. Again, it's quite rare in some of the traditions to speak about it that way, because they do tend to associate some of them associate that consciousness with the absolute, the source, because in a relative sense, it is, you could say, the source for all states of consciousness, or even the appearance of the physical world or the astral world. You could say they all do appear within that universal consciousness. So relatively, it's a kind of source for them. But anyway, yeah, in my case, there was a sense that it wasn't the all and everything. And so, I don't know how we're going to talk about it, but there was a shift or a transformation which concerned, I could say, union, that's the way I'm trying to put it, with what I was longing for, which I could only describe as God, in a way, in the sense that the whole time, what I had been yearning for was a union with God. And like I said, as a young kid, I did have an experience of, like, God, like a presence that I always felt was there, and that you could say that I had a relationship with, so I never, like, in a sense, felt that God was elsewhere. There was always a lived sense of the presence of God, and having more or a greater or lesser awareness of that, but evidently, like, you could say, what I had been seeking for was union with that, or mergence with that. What I was seeking for was really God, or sometimes they'd say the absolute itself. So there was a shift that happened. Again, it's hard to talk about because it's not really an experience, because it's going beyond experience itself. Like, even the waking up to universal consciousness is a kind of experience, even though you're waking up to the source of all experience, or that which, through which experience is experienced, any kind of experience. And even in that sort of universal consciousness, you are the universal subject, So in a sense, even from that sort of consciousness, there is still the appearance of subject and object. There's a subject which experiences objects, and there appears to be like a separation from it. Whereas in this, whatever happened in this sort of latter transformation, that collapsed. Like, the sense of there being a subject or a witness, and things that are separate to that are witnessed, that dissolved. When you could, another way of saying that is going beyond consciousness itself, because consciousness does seem to involve a kind of subject-object experience. And yeah, that was like, finally, you could say, after having sort of relatively not that long, 30 odd years, what I'd been seeking for all that time was found. There was a kind of like a relaxing, you could say, and seeking in that sense ended, because what I was been searching for was found, And again, the only way I could talk about that is, like, union with, in some traditions, they see union with the absolute, like even the universal consciousness, that universal I am, you could say, sort of like dissolves into the source, if you want to put it that way, or absolute, So in a sense, that was the final sort of satisfaction to the seeking that had always been there, And again, apparently life can continue, and there can be, interests in whatever they're interested in. But again, it's no longer motivated by the kind of energy of seeking, like seeking to acquire something, you know.
So it's like you connected with your divine spark within.
Yeah, well, you could say that.
Have divine sparks, your little mini god within you.
Yeah, you could say that, or you could, you could say that the apparent relationship between, I don't know, then the individual spark and its source, you know, with, the spark finally merged with the source. That's another way of putting it, you know. So at that end, from then on, like you could say that there's only, this is a way of talking about it, there's only God. Like there's no longer any like separate beings that are interacted with, and there's no longer a center of experience. Like prior to that, again, even with realizing like universal consciousness, there's still even though it's the universal subject, experience is still experienced from a center point. You know, there's an apparent center which appears to be, you could say, the center of every, you know, behind the center of my own world. There's an experiential center and a circumference to that, you know. But that's what collapsed. You could say there's no longer a experiential center, a subject, and set objects that are separate to that. You know, it's hard to try to talk about it, but that's all I could say. And that was the kind of, in a sense, the climax to my. That was the only thing that satisfied, put an end to that, whatever it was. I could say in my heart that was seeking, it was yearning. In a sense, it'd always been yearning for God. And eventually,
sorry, go on.
Well, it'd always been yearning for God, let's say, they put it that way. And eventually it found that, you know, but it didn't find it as like a relationship with God, because that had already been part of my life. It was the consummation of that relationship, you could say. You know, it's like knowing yourself as God, if you want to put it that way. Knowing that there is only God.
Oh, sorry.
No?
These things are difficult to explain in everyday language. It's an experiential for every person. Everybody's going to feel it maybe in a different way, but at the same time we're experiencing the divine. But it's difficult to express, you know, even in dance, you know, as speech, you know, it's very difficult to express how one has that. Which is why we're so lucky to have all these esoteric teachings to help us find our way to it. You know, even Ouspensky said it's very difficult to put all this into words.
Well, it's impossible. Yeah, I mean, it's impossible, you know. I mean, you could try as best as you can, but obviously it's because in a sense, like what has been spoken of is beyond the mind. You know, it's in a sense, it's beyond mental understanding, you know. So, I mean, yeah, we can try to put it in words as best we can, but it obviously always goes beyond that. But also, I suppose, as part of that sort of final consummation, another thing that was resolved in that was that I'd always been a bit of a, as I say, you know, say empathetic person, put it that way, in the sense that the apparent sufferings in the world, you know, had always caused me heartache. You know, I remember as a young kid, like when I first saw, there must have been like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 or 6, something like that, watching TV. And I don't know, I was watching some kids program, and then after that ended, there was an advert, and it was like a typical sort of Oxfam advert, you know, of like having kids in Africa or something like that. And I just remember, you know, like being horrified by that, like kind of looking around me and we're thinking, well, how can we then, as you know, like the people in my world that I was living in, you know, how come we aren't doing anything about it? How can I be here? How come I've got food and yet all these, you know, there's these people over there who are starving, you know? So that had always been a, you know, like a pain in the heart, you know, like knowing that there was people suffering out there. And like, you know, in a sense, but not that I, you know, went off and did like loads of charity work or anything, but the idea or the, you know, the feeling of people suffering, that had always been like a pain, you know, a concern, knowing that there's always apparently people, you know, I might be tucking into my dinner, enjoying it, and yet kind of at the same time knowing that, well, there's somebody else out there who's starving, you know. So that sense of people suffering had always been a concern for me, or something that caused unrest. But in this latter kind of realization or whatever happened, that finally brought an end to it, because it was realized that, again, like in a sense, there are no really separate people. You know, in a sense, they're just finger puppets on the hand of God, and that deep down there is only God, in a sense, and that God is, in a sense, beyond suffering. You know, it can appear to suffer in this or that being, but in a sense, what the essence of that's there is beyond that. So that was another kind of relief to the heart, to the heart that can be concerned with people suffering. Again, that's not to say that if I saw, like, I don't know, an old lady fall in the street, that I wouldn't go and help her.
But
yeah. It's quite different knowing that that in a sense there are no people who suffer. Again, it might sound insane.
It's difficult to get your head around. It is, because I went through all that as well, and as a teenager, I must admit, I got very down about the world. Growing up in the 80s was kind of like doom and gloom, and the nuclear bomb was going to go off any time and all that kind of thing. And then we had the Ethiopia thing and stuff. And I just grew up going, this world is so cruel. I'm sure we live in hell. And I was years I thought this was hell, this earth, but now I realize it's not. And I see the same as you, of it's beyond the divine. Everyone is beyond, or a part of the divine. So all this is just a fleeting moment. But at the same time, it's still going on. And if we can do our bit to help people, it obviously helps them live in this world, because not everyone's got that connection to the divine.
Yeah. I mean, like, again, in terms of my character, it didn't, it didn't change anything in terms of, like, again, prior to that, I would still help an old lady across the road if I saw her, or do it now. But I'm just saying that, again, it resolved that heartache that had been there concerning other people's suffering, because, again, it was, in a sense, it was seen that, like, you could say there are no really separate people, or like in Christianity, it's like, there's only really one spirit, and that spirit is like eternal and undying, and doesn't taste death. So the apparent suffering of people, in a sense, is just layers on top of that. That one spirit that is really eternal and incorruptible can't suffer. So again, you could also link that in Christian terms. That realization is like waking up to the kingdom of heaven, because it's like, you could say, realizing that everybody is already saved. That there are no real people who are lost, or who are like suffering. It's only God. There's only the Spirit, and it can appear to suffering this or that case, but in a sense, they're just surface appearances. So again, it's crazy. Like Christ says in the Bible, the kingdom of heaven's already here. It's at hand, but you don't see it. And looking out on the world from the typical perspective, that would seem insane to say that. How could the kingdom of heaven be here now, when there are children starving in Africa, or where there's bombs going on? Like that's, to the personal perspective, that's incomprehensible.
Well, I've just finished recording the Maurice Nicole book, as I was saying to you before, the new man, where he goes quite deeply into what you've just been saying. Because even though there are a lot of people suffering, they're still living on an earthly plane, rather trying to, like what you're saying, find the kingdom of God within them.
Yeah. That's, in a sense, you could say that again, they're like, from the perspective of unity, you could put that union. There is only God, so there are apparently, you could say, separate souls that are like seeking their way out of suffering and way back to God. But in a sense, you could say it's only God that's doing that. It's God appearing as these separate individuals or essences that can work their way, back up to God.
Well, love thy God. We're going to run out of time, so I'm going to bring this to an end, because I think that was quite an important point to end on. Anyway, really, we can't really top that.
The kingdom of heaven's already here.
Hallelujah! Praise be. Remember to love your God and love your neighbours. They're the two most important commandments. I did it that way. Love God, love your neighbour. So thank you, Josh.
Love conquers all.
Exactly. One love to everybody. So thank you very much, Josh.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for listening to my
And thank you, everybody, for watching. And if you have any questions for us to tackle in other shows, please just leave them in the comments. I shall leave the contacts of how you can read Josh's WordPress
Ranting.
down below. But we're about to run out. So thank you very much. Until next
Thanks,
time.
Debbie.
Peace.